What if the single trait separating a millionaire from someone who stays stuck for another decade has nothing to do with intelligence, luck, or timing? Tim Ferriss, the entrepreneur and investor behind the 4-Hour Workweek, spent years chasing that exact question through hundreds of episodes of his podcast, The Tim Ferriss Show. The answers he collected from those conversations with elite performers, entrepreneurs, and investors eventually became one dense, dangerous book, and today, inside the vault, we are opening it completely, page by page. The book is called Tools of Titans, and what makes it dangerous is that it was never meant to be motivational. It was built from raw transcripts, tested routines, and blunt confessions from people like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who wrote its foreword, Peter Thiel, and Jocko Willink. But there is one private struggle Ferriss himself admitted to on a public stage, one few people discuss, and by the end of this video, you will understand why it matters more than any tactic here. By the time this ends, you will know the morning sequence elite performers refuse to skip, the mental exercise that neutralizes fear faster than confidence, and the quiet philosophy investors use to escape decisions most people agonize over for years. There is also a number that changes how you read every success story from now on. Stay close because that number changes everything. And if this earns a place in your week, subscribing to the Book Vault costs nothing and hands you a real advantage. The strategic breakdown. The ritual that builds the machine. Now, we open the vault on a book that refuses to be a normal book, and the first case file inside it, the one the authors built their entire morning philosophy around, is called The Ritual That Builds the Machine. Ferriss noticed a pattern too consistent to be coincidence while reviewing hundreds of hours of interviews. Nearly every high performer he spoke with owned their first 60 minutes with an almost religious discipline, long before opening a single email or touching a phone. This is where mainstream advice collapses. Most productivity content tells you to attack your hardest task first thing in the morning, but that is not what the transcripts revealed. Instead, the pattern was regulation before ambition. Make the bed. Move the body. Sit in stillness for a few minutes. Only then does the mind get pointed at anything resembling a goal. The machine gets calibrated before it gets loaded with weight, and most people skip straight to the weight. Most people listening right now believe they are already disciplined because they wake up early. But deep down, you know that waking up early and owning your first hour are two completely different disciplines, and only one of them actually compounds. Inside the vault, we call this the difference between motion and control. Waking early is motion. Ritual is control. And control, not motion, is what separates the people in this book from everyone quietly burning out around them. And this next realization is the exact moment everything splits into before and after. The reason this ritual works is not psychological comfort. It is nervous system architecture. A calm, ordered first hour lowers reactive stress for the entire day that follows, which means every decision made afterward, every negotiation, every uncomfortable conversation gets made from a regulated state instead of a frantic one. That single shift in state is worth more than any productivity hack layered on top of a chaotic morning. But the ritual is only the entry fee. It gets you calm. It does not get you fearless. And fearlessness, the book argues, is the actual currency separating the titans from everyone else still waiting for permission to move. That is where the next case file begins, and it may be the most psychologically unsettling idea in the entire book, because it asks you to walk directly toward the exact thing you have spent years avoiding, the art of fear setting. Now, we enter the chapter Ferriss considers the single most valuable exercise in his own life, the one he calls the art of fear setting. In an essay published on his own site, tim.blog, Ferriss explains he performs this exercise at least once a quarter, often monthly, because it has produced his biggest business wins and prevented some of his worst potential mistakes. The exercise is deceptively simple. You define, in specific detail, the worst possible outcome of a decision you are avoiding. Most people think fear is something to eliminate. The book argues something far more uncomfortable. Fear is something to define in writing with brutal specificity until it stops being a fog and starts being a short, manageable list. Ferriss traces this practice directly back to Seneca and Stoic philosophy, and even describes deliberately simulating poverty for days at a time, sleeping on the floor, eating rice and beans, to prove his worst financial fear was survivable all along, not just in theory. That thought feels heavy, almost insulting. The idea that you might need to rehearse losing everything just to feel free, but once you sit with it, you realize it is the opposite of hopeless. If you already know exactly what happens on the other side of your worst outcome, and you already know you would survive it, the fear loses its leverage over you completely. The Vault perspective on this is different than most self-help content. Fear setting is not positivity, it is reconnaissance. And this is where human nature becomes dangerous. Most people avoid defining their fears because naming them feels like inviting them closer. But Ferriss discovered the reverse is true, and this idea was significant enough that he later expanded it into a widely viewed TED Talk titled Why You Should Define Your Fears Instead of Your Goals. The talk argues that traditional goal setting fails precisely because it ignores the invisible brake pedal fear keeps pressed on, quietly, underneath every ambition you claim to want. What comes next is the part most readers never reach because they stop at the tactic and never ask why it works. Fear setting works because vague anxiety is infinite, but a defined fear has edges, and anything with edges can be planned around, insured against, and survived. The people in this book were not less afraid than you. They simply refused to leave their fear undefined, and that single difference built fortunes most people assume required a different kind of courage. Discipline equals freedom. Before moving deeper into the operating principles of this book, there is a concept the authors return to again and again, and it is called discipline equals freedom. The phrase belongs to Jocko Willink, the former Navy SEAL commander whose interviews Ferriss features prominently throughout the wealthy and wise sections of the book. Willink's argument, distilled across the transcripts, is tactical rather than inspirational. Discipline is not restriction. It is the mechanism that manufactures every option. Freedom requires later. Most summaries skip this entirely. We will not. The mistake almost everyone makes is treating discipline as something you feel motivated into. Willink's position, reflected throughout the book, is the opposite. You do not wait to feel disciplined. You act disciplined until the feeling, if it ever arrives, becomes irrelevant. Waking at a fixed hour before the world demands anything of you is presented as the smallest, most repeatable proof that you control your own behavior instead of your behavior controlling you. And what I'm about to tell you is the part most people never even reach because they close the chapter the moment discipline starts feeling uncomfortable. The deeper layer most readers miss is that discipline, applied consistently and without negotiation, is what generates the actual leverage behind wealth. Every negotiation skill, every investment decision, every difficult conversation a founder needs to have depends on a nervous system that has already practiced doing hard things on command. Not only when motivation shows up, most people listening right now believe they lack discipline. But deep down, you know the truth is smaller and more uncomfortable than that. You have discipline. You simply have not aimed it at anything that requires you to feel uncomfortable on purpose. The Titans in this book were not immune to resistance. They just stopped negotiating with it every single morning, and that stopped negotiation is the exact hinge this entire chapter turns on. There is a reason this idea sits at the emotional center of the book. Discipline equals freedom sounds like a paradox until you experience it. The more structure you impose on your own behavior, the fewer decisions you burn energy on, and the more energy remains for the decisions that actually determine your trajectory. But discipline alone does not explain how the wealthiest people in this book think about money itself. What they know about wealth is so counterintuitive that most people spend their entire lives chasing the wrong target. The Titans' definition of wealth. We now enter the chapter that completely reshapes how ambitious readers think about wealth. The chapter called The Titans' Definition of Wealth. Naval Ravikant, the investor and entrepreneur whose interviews anchor much of the book's wealthy section, reframes the entire conversation around one deceptively simple idea. For any situation you find frustrating, you have exactly 3 real options. Accept it, change it, or remove yourself from it entirely. Inaction, he argues, is the only choice that is never acceptable. This is where mainstream advice collapses again. Most financial content obsesses over tactics, which stock, which fund, which side hustle. Ravikant's framework, as presented throughout the book, operates one level above tactics entirely. Wealth is not a number in an account. It is the compounding result of decisions made without unnecessary friction, repeated over years. Most people are too impatient to endure. The Titans in this book were not smarter about money. They were faster at eliminating indecision, and this next realization is the exact moment everything splits into before and after because it is the part of this book most people never even reach. The 3-option framework is not really about money at all. It is about ending the exhausting middle state most people live inside, the state where you have neither accepted your circumstances nor changed them. That thought feels uncomfortable, almost accusatory, because it implicates every situation you are currently tolerating without action, quietly, in the background, for years. But once you accept it, something shifts. If every frustrating circumstance only has 3 honest exits, then staying stuck is a choice you are making, not something happening to you. Late at night, when you put your phone down, a small voice comes, doesn't it? Quietly asking whether you are building something or simply staying comfortable enough to avoid the 3-option conversation with yourself. The Titans in this book had that same voice. They just refused to let it sit for another decade. Inside the vault, we call this the compounding decision effect. Every accepted, changed, or exited frustration frees up capacity, mental, emotional, and financial, that immediately gets redirected toward the next real opportunity instead of leaking away quietly. Wealth, in this framework, is simply the residue left behind by a life with almost no unresolved friction still draining your attention in the background. And this next chapter takes that same philosophy somewhere far more uncomfortable into the deliberate practice of losing everything on purpose. The practice of losing everything on purpose. We now arrive at the final case file, and it may be the most unsettling idea in the entire book, the one called the practice of losing everything on purpose. Ferriss writes about deliberately simulating financial ruin, wearing cheap clothing for weeks, sleeping without comfort, eating only the plainest food, drawing this directly from Seneca's Stoic teaching that you should periodically live your worst-case scenario to prove it is survivable. This is not a metaphor inside the book. It is a literal, repeated practice. The terrifying part is that most people never notice this pattern happening to them in reverse. Instead of rehearsing the worst case on purpose, they spend years quietly dreading it, which is more exhausting than actually experiencing a controlled version of it. The Titans in this book inverted the entire relationship with catastrophe. They stopped fearing the bottom by visiting it voluntarily on their own terms, with an exit already planned, which is precisely what makes the exercise powerful instead of reckless. In his interview on the Art of Manliness podcast, Ferriss directly addressed the obvious criticism of a book built entirely around successful people, acknowledging that survivorship bias is a real risk whenever you study only the winners. His answer was not to dismiss the critique, but to point toward the sheer volume behind it, roughly 10,000 pages of transcripts filtered down to this single book, giving readers a wider, more honest sample than any single success story ever could alone. This is the part of this book that most people never even reach, because by the final chapters, fatigue has usually already won. But here is where the book's deepest tension resolves. What looked like fear management earlier and a discipline framework in the middle were never separate ideas at all. They were the same skill applied to 3 different fronts: the mind, the body, and the balance sheet. And that skill is simply comfort with controlled discomfort. And this is where the story takes a turn most readers do not expect. Ferriss discusses, with unusual candor, that he faced serious depression, a struggle he later spoke about openly in a Design Matters interview with Debbie Millman. He has described fear as an emergency brake quietly left on, one that makes even reasonable goals feel unreachable until it is consciously released. Every tool in this book, the rituals, the fear setting, the discipline, exists to release exactly that brake. Key lessons and insights. Regulate before you ambition. The first lesson this book teaches us, and perhaps the one most people underestimate, is what we call regulate before you ambition. Your first 60 minutes are not for productivity, they are for control. Elite performers across the transcripts owned that window with near-religious consistency, calming the nervous system before loading it with decisions. Apply this by protecting 1 hour before any screen touches your hand, and notice how differently every difficult conversation lands for the rest of that day. Define the monster to kill it. The second lesson this book teaches us, and one of the most quietly radical ideas in the entire book, is what we call define the monster to kill it. Fear left vague is infinite. Fear, written down with dates, dollar amounts, and worst-case specifics, becomes something you can plan around. Apply this the next time a decision feels paralyzing by writing the absolute worst outcome in detail, then writing exactly how you would recover, because recovery plans dissolve fear faster than confidence ever could. Act before you feel ready. The third lesson this book teaches us, borrowed directly from Jocko Willink's contribution to the book, is what we call act before you feel ready. Discipline is never the reward of motivation. It is the manufacturer of it. Apply this by choosing one uncomfortable, non-negotiable action daily at a fixed time, regardless of mood, because that single repeated proof of self-control becomes the foundation every other ambition in your life eventually gets built on top of. Kill the middle state, The fourth lesson this book teaches us, drawn from Naval Ravikant's framework inside the book, is what we call kill the middle state. Every frustrating situation offers exactly 3 honest exits: accept it, change it, or leave it, and nothing else is acceptable long-term. Apply this by naming one situation you have tolerated without action for months, then choosing one of the 3 exits this week, because the paralyzed middle is where ambition quietly goes to die unnoticed. Trust the sample, not the story. The fifth and final lesson this book teaches us answers a question we opened with tonight, the one about a specific number most readers scroll past without noticing. We call this lesson Trust the Sample, Not the Story. That number is roughly 200, the count of interviews distilled into this single book, existing precisely to counter survivorship bias with sheer volume instead of a single flattering certainty. Apply this by never building your strategy around one inspiring success story again. The vault closing. There is a reason this book has stayed relevant for years after its release, and it has very little to do with any single tactic inside it. Tools of Titans works because it refuses to promise a shortcut. Every ritual, every fear-setting exercise, every discipline habit inside it exists for one purpose: to prove that the gap between where you are and where you believe you deserve to be is smaller and far more survivable than the fear currently telling you it is. Here is your specific action for the next 7 days. Choose one fear you have been avoiding defining and write it down in full, worst outcome included, exactly the way this book teaches. Then write your recovery plan underneath it in equal detail. That single page, uncomfortable as it will feel to complete, will teach you more about your own capacity than another month of consuming advice you never act on ever could. And remember the question we opened with tonight, the one about the private struggle almost no one talks about. Ferriss built this book, in part, as his own answer to depression. Proof gathered from that number we promised would change everything. Roughly 200 interviews, 10,000 pages of transcripts. That discomfort, fear, and even collapse are survivable when you stop avoiding them and start studying them directly. If this breakdown gave you a real advantage tonight, like this video, subscribe to the Book Vault, and comment your biggest takeaway below, because the next masterclass is already waiting.